What's up, sports bettors? I'm going to go through a strategy that you can use 100% for free to find good NFL bets early in the week. So I'm really excited about it. Obviously, we talk a lot about OddsJam, positive EV, finding value, things like that, which are critical as a sports bettor. It's all about finding value, beating the vig long term. But what I'm going to show you is something that's a little more finger to the wind, a little harder, to kind of put an exact profit margin. Like this bet we know has a 3.7 profit margin. Braxton Garrett under 4.5 strikeouts. But what we're going to be covering today is a little more, finger to the wind. So what this is it's taking advantage of early line discrepancies in player prop markets. So you'll see, a lot of sports books have released player prop odds for the Thursday game, right? Matt Ryan, his rushing yards line, has an OU of 1.5. I know that's not particularly thrilling, but that's true, right? Here's his rushing yards line, over under 1.5. But what you'll see is there's only a few sports books that have started to release odds, basically just PrizePicks and Underdog Fantasy for Sunday, right? So that goes for player rushing, for player passing, as well as player receiving yards. So what you can do is use this OddsJam screen, which there will be a link in the description. It's 100% free to use for any market you want to look at, right? But what I like to do is kind of open it up, look at the games where only a couple sportsbooks have posted lines, and just look for big discrepancies, right? So you can see even the first two we look at, Romeo Doubs in the Packers-Giants game and Alan Lazard, there's a 5-yard difference between PrizePicks and Underdog Fantasy. Like, that's a big jump. If we take a look at, obviously some of these jumps aren't massive. If we look at the Vikings game, 50.5 versus 49.5 for Adam Thielen, not that big of a jump. But some of them are pretty big, right? So if you actually take a look at player passing yards and rushing yards, you'll see some big ones. So as an example, here's a pretty big jump. We have Ryan Tannehill. His passing yards over-under is 205.5 yards on PrizePicks, and on Underdog Fantasy, it's 220.5. So what you could do is you could bet the over on PrizePicks, the under on Underdog Fantasy, and you have a middle on, right? You're taking over 205, under 220.5. So if there's exactly 210 passing yards, 215 passing yards, whatever, for Ryan Tannehill, you're hitting your over on PrizePicks and your under on Underdog Fantasy. That's the exact same thing as a middle bet, right? OddsJam has a betting tool for middles. But what's cool about this is you can kind of look at every game side by side, and just pick off these big discrepancies. Zach Wilson, 10-yard difference. So what we can do is we can lock in a play, and there are a few players I zoned in on. So the first is AJ Dillon. So on Underdog Fantasy, we like to play 3 pick entries because the implied odds are better, the implied prices are better. But what you'll see for AJ Dillon is like, hey, he's had 73, 32, 61, and 45 rushing yards in the 4 games they've had this season. This game went into OT, so obviously he's going to be a bit higher there, or he's projected to be a bit higher there. So what you can do is you can see for AJ Dillon, like there's a 7-yard jump. That's massive. One of these bets has to be good. 7 yards is a big deal, right? It's enough to beat the vig, beat the juice. Like the probability that AJ Dillon ends up between, if I zoom in a bit, 50.5 and 57.5 rushing yards is pretty big, right? It's probably like, 20%, maybe even a little bit higher. So this is, or maybe not that high, maybe like, 17.5. We could model it out, kind of using a Poisson calculator. But long story short, his distribution is kind of centered around 50, 55 rushing yards per game. So that jump from 50.5 to 57.5 is pretty massive. So AJ Dillon, right? Maybe we take his under 57.5 on Underdog. It's cashed half of the games this season. Maybe that's the first play we want to go with. 7-yard difference, that's a pretty big deal, right? As the total gets higher, what you'll notice is the differences are going to be bigger, right? 7 yards for Kirk Cousins from 255.5 to 262.5 is not as big of a deal, right? Because the total is so much higher. as AJ Dillon 50.5 to 57.5, right? When you're looking for middles, like this is 7 yards, this is 7 yards. But obviously, if you think about 1 point in the NBA versus 1 run in baseball, which has a much lower scoring total, obviously middles in baseball or hockey are going to be a lot more valuable when it's just one. Like if you could get a 1 point, like over 7.5, under 8.5 runs in the MLB, that's a lot more valuable than over 218.5, under 219.5 in the NBA, right? So you're always looking for, kind of where the total is ideally lower and the differences are still pretty big, which is why we mainly are going to skip over these passing yards plays, even though there are some big discrepancies. You got Jacoby Brissett, 10 yards. Ryan Tannehill is 15 yards, so that's pretty big. And Carson Wentz is also 15 yards. So they're probably still profitable, but they're not going to be as amazing as some of these other ones we can find in player rushing or receiving. So the first one we looked at was AJ Dillon, so that's great. Next, we can look at this Romeo Doubs, right? We can go to him and player receiving yards. Here, it's a 5-yard difference, so that's pretty big. And what you can see is he's gone, under, over. But this game went to OT, so maybe we like his under. Maybe that's the first play we go with. So what we can do is we can go to Doubs and we can hit the under. And maybe that's the first play we go with, right? 5 yards, again, when the distribution is kind of centered around such a low total, 40.5 to 45.5, definitely enough to beat the vig. We can look at Lazard. He's gone, 13, 45, 116. So maybe we like this play as opposed to Doubs. I mean, it's kind of up to you. Obviously, if this is a little more hand wavy than positive EV betting. So, here we have 6 yards, so this difference is bigger for Amari Cooper. So how do we feel about Amari Cooper? 6 yards. Under, over, under. So maybe Amari Cooper's a play you like. I don't know. So the first play we can put down is Dillon. So I'm going to actually go with Dillon just because the difference is bigger as opposed to Doubs. And I'll look for plays in a few different games. So this is the first play we're going to go with. We can look at Terry McLaurin, and we can see here he's got 15, 75, 58, 102. So we can take a look at his receiving yards line because that was a pretty big difference. So we have Terry. Here you go, 6 yards. Pretty big. Here we have 6 yards for Diggs. So some of these differences are pretty big. We have Christian Kirk, Jalen Waddle, under. So Jalen Waddle. And you can also take the overs on PrizePicks and the unders on Underdog if the differences are big enough. But again, it's just kind of a valuable tool for, kind of analyzing player props and zoning in on sharp bets. So maybe the plays we go with are just, Dillon, Amari Cooper, and then the third pick we wanted was Terry. So you always want to go with 3 picks kind of on Underdog Fantasy, and we'll play this small, maybe just hit it for $25 in unders, kind of parlay on Underdog Fantasy. Just because, again, this is a little more hand wavy. This is kind of like looking at games side by side and kind of trying to back out, okay, these are pretty big differences. We think we're getting enough to beat the vig, yada, yada, yada. Like Jalen Waddle, you can see 65.5, 72.5. You can also put on some middles. You can take the over. You can take the under. You can do all sorts of things here. But long story short, it's just a useful tool for kind of looking at discrepancies. So hopefully you can take advantage of it. You can let us know kind of, maybe you're seeing opportunities in the MLB. So if we go over to MLB, you can open up different sports. So what we can do is just go here and see what is out there. So you can go to like player strikeouts. You can put it in the specific market you want to go to any sport. But anyways, hopefully this was helpful. Feel free to comment any feedback about the screen below, and let's make some money, guys.